All right, we've already talked about how to take a complex form and turn it into a polar form of a complex number. And the abbreviation, of course, is this. Today we're going to talk about a little math with these things. We're going to learn to multiply them and we're going to learn to divide them. So there's a formula that's used, if you will. So if I have r times, and I'll make it r sub 1, times the cosine of theta sub 1 plus I times the sine of theta sub 1 times r sub 2 times the cosine of theta sub 2 plus I times the sine of theta sub 2. You can see that I'm multiplying two of these forms together. Then the way that I put them together is I take the r sub 1 times the r sub 2, and then I'm going to multiply that whole thing times the cosine of theta sub 1 plus theta sub 2 plus I times sine of theta sub 1 plus theta sub 2. All right, let's go ahead and do a problem like this, and you can see how it'll work together. Let's say I have 3 times the cosine of 7 pi over 6 plus I times the sine of 7 pi over 6 times 2 times the cosine of 2 pi over 3 plus I times the sine of 2 pi over 3. All right, so I'm multiplying this times this, and according to my formula, I'm going to take the r's on the outside and I'm going to multiply them together. That whole thing is going to be multiplied by the cosine of the 7 pi over 6 plus the 2 pi over 3 plus I times the sine of 7 pi over 6 plus 2 pi over 3. All right, when I add those things together, I'm going to get, obviously I got to do a common denominator there, which is going to give me 4 pi over 6. So I have 6 times the cosine of 11 pi over 6 plus I times the sine of 11 pi over 6. Well, the only thing that's left to do then is give me my values there. So I have 6 times the cosine at 11 pi over 6 is the square root of 3 over 2. And the sine at 11 pi over 6 is negative 1/2. Then I'm going to distribute my 6. So it's going to give me 3 on the square root of 3 plus negative 3i. I'm always going to put the I at the end. And that's going to be my answer for when I multiply those two things together. All right, I'm going to give you one to try. I'm going to erase all that. I hope you've got that down. If not, pause the video and write it. So, multiply these two things together. Which is going to give me 8 pi over 12, which reduces down to 2 pi over 3. So I have 21, 7 times 3, times, you're going to do the cosine of 7 pi over 12 plus pi over 12 plus I times the sine of those same things added together. This is the formula. Okay, so I've got 21 times the cosine at 2 pi over 3 plus I times the sine at 2 pi over 3, which is going to give me 21 times negative 1/2 plus the square root of 3 over 2i. So I have negative 21 over 2 plus 21 on the square root of 3 over 2i. And that's my final answer for that. All right, then we're going to do the same thing with quotients. Now, the thing about the quotients is you're going to do a similar thing, except for you're going to subtract the angles rather than add the angles. So I'm going to write out the formula for that. And then we'll do a couple of them. So let's say I have r times the cosine, and I go ahead and do sub 1's and sub 2's again. And then on the bottom I have the sub 2's. All right, so what I'm going to do, the formula says, what I do is I divide those two r's and I multiply it by the cosine of theta sub 1 minus theta sub 2 plus I times the sine of theta sub 1 minus theta sub 2. So it's the same thing except for the r's are divided rather than multiplied, and the angles are subtracted rather than added. So let's do one of these. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide my r's. So I have 12 divided by 4, so that's 3. And that is multiplied by the cosine of theta over, or pi over 4 minus 3 pi over 2 plus I times the sine of pi over 4 minus 3 pi over 2. So then I have 3 times the cosine. And I'm going to have a common denominator there, so that's going to end up being 6 over 4, or negative 5 pi over 4. And the sine of negative 5 pi over 4. And then my value there at negative 5 pi over 4 is negative square root of 2 over 2. And the sine value is the positive square root of 2 over 2. So when I multiply this, my final answer is negative 3 on the square root of 2 over 2 plus 3 on the square root of 2 over 2i. And remember the I goes at the end. All right, I'm going to have you try one and then I'll give you some homework on it. So this was kind of a short section. I have 10 on the cosine of 3 pi over 10 plus I times the sine of 3 pi over 10 divided by 2 times the cosine of pi over 20 plus I times the sine of pi over 20. All right, work it, then come back to the video. All right, I'm going to take 10 divided by 2, which is 5, times the cosine of 3 pi over 10 minus pi over 20 plus I times the sine of 3 pi over 10 minus pi over 20. So this is going to give me, if you work it all out, you're going to have to make this as a common denominator. So you've got the cosine of, this is going to become 6 over 20. Because I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by that. So I'm going to have 5 pi over 20, or when I reduce that down, pi over 4. So I have 5 times the square root of 2 over 2 plus I times the square root of 2 over 2. I multiply it. So I've got 5 on the square root of 2 over 2 plus 5 on the square root of 2 over 2. And don't forget the I is on that back part because that's the imaginary part. All right, so your homework is page 596 through 597, 10 through 23, all. Okay.